What happens when Hollywood's most legendary tough guy meets daytime television's most controversial host? You won't believe what unfolds when Clint Eastwood sits down with Joy Behar on The View. And let me tell you, this isn't your typical celebrity chat. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what transpires when these two titans clash in what becomes the most explosive television moment of the year. Last night's episode of The View was supposed to be a celebration of cinema history. Clint Eastwood, the 94-year-old director and actor, was making a rare television appearance to discuss his latest film project and reflect on his decades-long career. What started as what seemed like a respectful interview quickly devolved into a battlefield of ideologies that had viewers across America glued to their screens, watching in stunned silence as one of Hollywood's most respected figures found himself under attack. The tension was palpable from the moment Eastwood walked onto the set. Joy Behar, known for her sharp tongue and political commentary, greeted the screen legend with what appeared to be genuine warmth, but those familiar with her interviewing style could sense something brewing beneath the surface. Eastwood, dressed in his characteristic casual blazer and looking every bit the seasoned professional, took his seat with the quiet confidence that has defined his 6-decade career in entertainment. "Welcome to The View, Mr. Eastwood," Joy began, her voice carrying that familiar edge that regular viewers know all too well. "It's an honor to have you here. I have to say, at 94, you're still making movies, still working. What drives you to keep going?" Eastwood, leaning back in his chair with that signature squint, responded in his gravelly voice. "Well, Joy, I've always believed in staying active, staying engaged with the world. Making movies, telling stories, that's what I do. It's not about age, it's about having something to say." The pleasantries continued for several minutes, with questions about his latest directorial effort and reflections on his iconic roles. But viewers could sense Joy was building towards something bigger. Her questions became more pointed, her demeanor shifted subtly, and the other co-hosts seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. "Now, Clint," Joy said, her tone becoming more serious, "you've been in Hollywood for over 60 years. You've seen a lot of changes. Some people might say the industry has become too political, too focused on social issues rather than entertainment. What's your take on that?" It was a loaded question, and everyone in the studio knew it. Eastwood paused, considering his words carefully. "I think movies have always reflected the times we live in, Joy. Whether it's westerns dealing with frontier justice or war films exploring conflict, art has always been connected to society. The key is telling authentic stories, not pushing agendas." Joy's eyes lit up with what could only be described as predatory interest. "But surely you can't deny that Hollywood has a responsibility to address important social issues. Climate change, social justice, equality, these aren't just political talking points. They're moral imperatives." The first crack in Eastwood's composed demeanor appeared as he shifted in his seat. "I believe in individual responsibility, Joy. I believe in people making their own choices and dealing with the consequences. I don't think it's Hollywood's job to tell people how to think or live their lives." "Individual responsibility," Joy repeated, her voice taking on a mocking tone that made several audience members shift uncomfortably. "That's interesting coming from someone who's made millions portraying vigilante justice and violence as solutions to complex problems." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunfight. Eastwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "My characters face difficult situations and make hard choices. That's what drama is about. I've never glorified violence. I've shown its consequences." Joy wasn't backing down. In fact, she seemed energized by Eastwood's defensive response. "Really? Because Dirty Harry shooting suspects without due process, or your westerns where the good guy solves everything with a gun, doesn't that send a pretty clear message about how you think problems should be solved?" The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees. Eastwood's legendary composure was beginning to show hairline cracks, like ice under pressure. "Those are fictional characters, Joy. Entertainment. I think audiences are smart enough to understand the difference between a movie and real life." "Are they, though?" Joy pressed, leaning forward with the intensity of a prosecutor cross-examining a hostile witness. When we see the violence in our streets, the political divisions, the people who think they can take the law into their own hands, don't you think the media we consume shapes our behavior? What happened next would be talked about for weeks to come, as Eastwood's response revealed just how deep this confrontation was about to go. Eastwood's eyes narrowed to slits that would have made his man-with-no-name character proud. But there was real anger simmering beneath the surface now. "Joy, I've been making movies since before you were even thinking about getting into television. I've explored themes of justice, morality, and human nature in ways that have resonated with audiences for generations. To suggest that I'm somehow responsible for society's problems is not just wrong, it's insulting." The studio audience was dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop as these two entertainment veterans faced off like gunfighters at high noon. Joy, however, seemed to interpret Eastwood's defensive response as weakness, doubling down with the ruthless precision that had made her both famous and infamous. "Insulting?" Joy's voice rose an octave, her hands gesturing dramatically. "What's insulting is a privileged white man who's made a fortune off violence telling the rest of us about responsibility. You want to talk about consequences? Let's talk about the consequences of decades of toxic masculinity in Hollywood, of glorifying revenge culture, of promoting the idea that might makes right." The other co-hosts exchanged worried glances. This had moved far beyond a typical celebrity interview into dangerous territory. Eastwood's face was stone, but his knuckles were white as he gripped the arms of his chair. When he spoke, his voice carried the controlled fury of a man who had reached his limit. "Lady, I don't know what your problem is, but I didn't come here to be lectured by someone who clearly knows nothing about my work or my values. I've spent my entire career trying to tell honest stories about complex people facing difficult choices. If you can't understand the difference between exploring themes and promoting violence, then maybe you shouldn't be interviewing filmmakers." Joy's response was immediate and vicious. "Oh, so now I'm too stupid to understand your complex art? That's typical, isn't it? When challenged about the harmful messages in your films, attack the intelligence of the person asking the questions." Very mature for a 94-year-old. The personal attack hit its mark. Eastwood's composure finally cracked, and for the first time in decades of public appearances, the legendary actor looked genuinely angry. "I've been nothing but respectful since I walked in here, despite your obvious agenda. But if you want to make this personal, we can do that." "Personal?" Joy laughed, but it was a harsh, ugly sound. Everything is personal when you're in the public eye making movies that influence millions of people. You don't get to hide behind "it's just entertainment" when your characters have become symbols for a certain type of American man, the kind who thinks violence is the answer to every problem. Eastwood leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting would have. "You know what your problem is, Joy? You think you can psychoanalyze 60 years of work based on your political prejudices. You see what you want to see, not what's actually there." "What I see," Joy shot back, her voice rising to match her increasing agitation, "is a man who's built an empire on outdated masculine fantasies, while the world has moved on. The strong, silent type who solves problems with his fists and his gun, that's not heroic anymore, Clint. That's toxic." The word toxic hung in the air like a challenge. Eastwood's jaw worked silently for a moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried decades of accumulated frustration with critics who had never understood what he was trying to accomplish. "Toxic? Let me tell you what's toxic. Sitting in judgment of people whose work you clearly haven't bothered to understand. My characters aren't perfect heroes, they're flawed human beings trying to do what they think is right in impossible situations. The whole point is to show that violence has consequences, that justice is complicated, that there are no easy answers." Joy wasn't listening. She was in full attack mode now, her voice getting louder and more confrontational with each word. "No easy answers? Your movies are full of easy answers. Bad guy shows up, good guy shoots him, problem solved. That's not complexity. That's simplistic wish fulfillment for people who want to believe the world is black and white." "You're twisting everything I've ever tried to do," Eastwood said, his voice tight with controlled rage. Unforgiven was specifically about the horror of violence, about how killing changes a man. Gran Torino was about overcoming prejudice and finding redemption. Million Dollar Baby dealt with impossible moral choices, but you don't want to discuss those themes because they don't fit your narrative. Joy waved dismissively, as if 60 years of acclaimed filmmaking could be brushed aside with a gesture. Oh, please, one or two movies with deeper themes doesn't erase decades of Dirty Harry and Western fantasies. And let's be honest about Gran Torino, wasn't that just another story about a white man saving minorities while spouting racial slurs for shock value? That was the breaking point. Something shifted in Eastwood's demeanor, a fundamental change that anyone who knew him would recognize as the moment when diplomacy ended and real confrontation began. Eastwood stood up slowly, his full height casting a shadow over the interview table. When he spoke, his voice carried the cold, measured tone of a man who had finally heard enough. "That's it. I'm done with this circus." Joy looked momentarily stunned by his sudden movement, but quickly recovered, sensing blood in the water. "Oh, what's wrong, Clint? Can't handle a little criticism? Is the big tough guy getting his feelings hurt?" "Feelings hurt?" Eastwood's laugh was bitter and humorless. "Lady, I've been criticized by better people than you for 40 years. The difference is, they actually watched my movies before they opened their mouths. You're just another talking head who thinks controversy equals insight." The other co-hosts looked like deer in headlights, completely unprepared for this level of confrontation. Joy, however, was in her element, feeding off the drama like a vampire feeding on blood. "So now I don't know movies. I've been in this business longer than some of your co-stars have been alive. I know exactly what your films represent, the last gasps of a dying patriarchal system that can't accept that the world has moved beyond its simple-minded solutions." Eastwood's eyes blazed with fury. "Simple-minded? You want to talk about simple-minded? You've taken a complex body of work spanning 6 decades and reduced it to a political talking point. You've ignored every theme, every character arc, every moral complexity, just so you can make some cheap point about toxic masculinity. Because that's what it is." Joy shot back, now standing as well, her voice reaching a shrill pitch that made several audience members cringe. "You can dress it up in fancy director talk all you want, but your movies are about one thing: men solving problems through violence. And now, we live in a world where people think that's actually how life works." "My movies are about consequences," Eastwood said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more power than shouting. "They're about flawed people making difficult choices and living with the results. If you can't see that, then you're either willfully ignorant or just plain stupid." The personal insult hit Joy like a slap. Her face flushed red with rage, and when she spoke, all pretense of professional decorum vanished. "Stupid? How dare you? I have a college degree. I've been in television for decades. I've interviewed presidents and world leaders. Just because I won't bow down to your outdated machismo doesn't make me stupid." "No," Eastwood replied with devastating calm, "but reducing 60 years of filmography to a political stereotype does. You came into this interview with your mind already made up. You weren't interested in having a conversation. You wanted to ambush me with your preconceived notions." Joy's voice became even more shrill, her composure completely gone. "Ambush? I asked you legitimate questions about the messages in your films. If you can't defend your work without resorting to personal attacks, then maybe your work isn't worth defending." That was the final straw. Eastwood's face went cold as granite, and when he spoke, his words cut through the studio like a knife through silence. "You know what, Joy? You're absolutely right about one thing. This conversation is over. I came here thinking I was going to have an intelligent discussion about filmmaking with a professional. Instead, I find myself being lectured by someone who's confused, being loud with being right." He turned toward the exit, but Joy wasn't finished. "That's right, run away. Just like your characters always do when they can't shoot their way out of a problem." Eastwood stopped dead in his tracks. The entire studio held its breath as he slowly turned back to face her. When he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of his legendary screen presence. "Lady, my characters face their problems head-on. They don't hide behind a panel of enablers making cheap shots at people who actually create something instead of just tearing it down." "Create something?" Joy's laugh was hysterical now. You've created a generation of men who think they're cowboys in the modern world. You've romanticized violence and called it art. Eastwood looked at her with something approaching pity. And you've made a career out of being professionally offended by everything you don't understand. At least my work requires talent. The insult landed like a nuclear bomb. Joy's face went white, then red, then white again. For perhaps the first time in her television career, she was speechless. The other co-hosts looked like they wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. "You sanctimonious old fool," Joy finally managed, her voice shaking with rage. "How dare you question my talent? I've worked twice as hard as any man in this business to get where I am." "Then maybe you should act like it," Eastwood replied, his voice cutting through her hysteria like a scalpel. "Maybe you should try having a conversation, instead of staging an execution. Maybe you should actually watch the movies you're criticizing before you open your mouth." With that, he began walking toward the exit again. Joy, desperate not to let him have the last word, called out after him, "Don't you walk away from me. We're not finished here." Eastwood paused at the edge of the stage, turned back one final time, and delivered the line that would be replayed on social media for months to come. "Yes, we are. I've wasted enough time listening to someone who mistakes volume for intelligence and prejudice for insight. Good luck with your show, Joy. You're going to need it." And with that, Clint Eastwood walked off the View stage, leaving behind a stunned audience, speechless co-hosts, and one very red-faced Joy Behar. The cameras kept rolling as Joy tried desperately to regain her composure, but the damage was done. In less than 20 minutes, she had managed to alienate one of Hollywood's most respected figures and expose her own unprofessionalism to millions of viewers. The interview that was supposed to be a celebration of cinema history had instead become a masterclass in how not to conduct a professional interview. And as the credits rolled over the chaos, viewers across America were left with one undeniable truth. They had just witnessed television history. The night Joy Behar finally met her match in the most unexpected way possible.